Welcome to Yahoo Finance Sports Report, a unique look at the business of sports, brought to you by Yahoo Finance and Yahoo Sports. I'm your host, Joe Pompliano, and I'm here to coach you through the financial game. We're going to look beyond the headlines, analyze all the latest sports news, the teams, trades, and billion-dollar deals, so you and your portfolio will win big. This week, we're talking about F1 weekend in Las Vegas, the latest in the settlement between the NBA and Warner Brothers Discovery, the future of name, image, and likeness, and so much more. Plus, Yahoo Sports' own Ross Dellinger is stopping by the show to talk college football. Let's huddle up and get right into it. All right, it's time for this week's Pomps Playbook, where I take a look at some of the biggest headlines in sports that you and your portfolio need to know. Let's kick things off with the lawsuit settlement between the NBA and Warner Brothers Discovery. So for those of you who haven't been paying attention, Warner Brothers Discovery sued the NBA after losing out on their media rights package earlier this year. The settlement has been going on for a long time, and it finally came to a conclusion earlier this week. Warner Brothers is going to be getting a few additional assets, and the NBA is going to be moving on with its new partner, Amazon. This is sort of a win-win for everyone because the NBA gets to move on with Amazon. ESPN gets inside the NBA from Warner Brothers, who's going to be licensing them the wildly successful show. And Warner Brothers is now going to get to sub-license some college football and college basketball games from ESPN. Again, a win for everyone involved. Next up, I want to talk about Flutter Entertainment. Now, Flutter Entertainment is the parent company of FanDuel Sportsbook, and they had a strong quarter according to their last earnings report. We talked a little bit about DraftKings last week, and FanDuel is in the same exact boat. Sports betting is becoming more popular across the United States, and companies like FanDuel and DraftKings are both benefiting. FanDuel says that they still had a net loss of $114 million this past quarter, but total revenue came in at $3.25 billion. They grew 51% on a total wagering basis in the U.S., and they added a ton of new customers in the U.S. Now, that loss needs to be put into context because if you think about sportsbooks in general, as new states come to market, they pump a bunch of money into marketing those products in those states so they can get as many customers as possible. So that money eventually comes down, and each state takes a couple of years, but they all will eventually become profitable, according to FanDuel and DraftKings. The last thing I want to talk about today in Pomps Playbook is Formula One headed to the Las Vegas for the Grand Prix, their second year in a row. Now, this is a huge deal because many people were upset that Formula One decided to add a third U.S. race last year, with one already in Miami, another in Austin, and now one in Las Vegas. But this was a huge event last year. Liberty Media invested more than $500 million into a permanent paddock building that's 300,000 square feet right off the Las Vegas Strip. They had a ton of people attend the event, and it reportedly brought in a $1.5 billion economic impact, with visitors alone spending $864 million. So Vegas is back in the fold again this year, and this is super important for Formula One as a whole because if you think about Formula One, it's an asset-light business. Essentially what they always do is they just go and bring the circus to town. They get a hosting fee in return, and the promoter then goes out and sells tickets, sponsorships, food, merchandise, and everything like that. Whereas in Las Vegas, this was the first race ever that Formula One actually hosted and acted as the promoter themselves. They're doing it again this year, and my guess is if everything continues to go well, they'll do this for more races as the calendar moves on. This week for the deeper dive, where I give you a play-by-play analysis of news in the sports world and its significance to your bottom line, we're talking about the sports car giant Ferrari. Now, the reason I want to talk about Ferrari is one, because they just released Q3 earnings and it was a blowout. Where every other luxury brand in the automotive space seems to be struggling, Ferrari is kind of killing it. Q3 revenue came in at $1.79 billion. That's a 7% increase year over year. Net profit came in at over $400 million, a 13% increase year over year. And if you add that earnings report to their previous two this year, Ferrari's 9-month revenue is at $5.39 billion, an 11% jump year over year. And their 9-month net profit is at a ridiculous $1.24 billion, an 18% jump year over year. Now, these results are great in a vacuum, but they're even more impressive when you consider the fact that Ferrari does not spend a dime on traditional advertising. We're talking about commercials, sponsorships, or anything like that. In fact, for those that don't know the history, Ferrari was never really meant to be a car company. The founder, Enzo Ferrari, spent decades almost exclusively obsessing over the performance of his Scuderia Ferrari racing team. He used to race cars himself, then he built this team. And he only started selling sports cars as a way to fund his sports car team. But this wasn't just a unique way to do things by Enzo Ferrari. It quite literally changed how people think about business models today and marketing in general. Think about Red Bull, that certainly comes to mind. They copied Ferrari. The same thing can be said for Mercedes and Aston Martin and McLaren and Alpine Renault. All of those teams in Formula One are essentially now trying to deploy the same model that Ferrari has been working on for decades. Now, Ferrari acts on this limited supply model where they only sell about 13,000 cars each year, but this is also sort of a sweet spot. It's 2 times more inventory than Aston Martin sells at just over 6,600 cars, but it's a fraction of what Mercedes and Alpine sell at over 2 million cars each calendar year. This model works so well because Ferrari knows that if they build fast cars and win races on the track, the demand for their product will always exist because they have so many fans. A great example of this is that Mercedes used to brag in its annual reports that the German car company received 25% of all television time during their championship winning seasons in Formula One. Now, some will say that this is just a throwaway line to impress shareholders, but that TV time is worth more than $5 billion in advertising value because Formula One averages 90 million viewers each race weekend. That's essentially a Super Bowl, but instead of happening just once a year, it happens more than 20 times each calendar year. Now, this has had a huge impact on Ferrari's business. And the more interesting part to me is that this used to be a budget, a loss loser for the brand as a way to market their road cars. But now the Formula One team has actually turned into a profitable marketing channel. The reason for this is because Formula One introduced a cost cap a few years ago. Think about this as a salary cap in football or basketball. It limits how much a team can spend each year to promote heritage. But what it did for a team like Ferrari, who was spending way more than everyone else, is it cut their expenses in half, and now they're turning a $50 million annual profit on the team, and the team's enterprise value has approached more than $3 billion. So not only is it a great marketing channel for the car company, but now it's a profitable endeavor for the brand as well. This has enabled Ferrari they only ship about 3,800 cars this past quarter or 3,300 cars this past quarter. But the reason why this is so important is because they're a luxury brand. They still do over $100,000 in profit per car annually. It's an incredible result, and it's part of the reason why their stock price is up more than 150% over the last 5 years, whereas other F1 brands like a Mercedes that's down 0.6%, an Alpine Renault that's down 12%, and an Aston Martin who's down 91% over the same time period have seen their sales decline, whereas Ferrari, like I said, is killing it. We've made it to the one-on-one, a conversation where I get to break down news and sports with a key player in the industry. This week for my one-on-one, I am joined by Yahoo Sports' senior college football reporter, Ross Dellinger. Welcome to the show, Ross. So I'd love to start with something that doesn't necessarily feel like it involves college football, but it does. And that's the settlement between the NBA and Warner Brothers Discovery. So many people listening will know that the NBA and Warner Brothers were in a lawsuit over matching rights and their ability to match Amazon's deal for the NBA rights. But as part of this settlement that got approved this week, some college football and college basketball games are also changing hands. Ross, can you just explain a little bit what's happening here and why this is coming out of an NBA lawsuit?
Yeah, that's right. It's kind of a overshadowed piece of the NBA settlement situation is that the Big 12 is involved, and basically um, Warner Brothers Discovery and TNT Sports in general will get sub-license from ESPN 13 Big 12 football games every year starting next fall, and will get 15 men's basketball games starting not this coming season, but next season. And it's sort of what described to me as a network trade involved in the fact that ESPN will now get the TNT show inside the NBA, and I'll be able to air that show. So it was certainly for the Big 12 side, for the college sports side, it's huge because the conference moves football games that were scheduled for streaming only on ESPN Plus to now a linear carrier on TNT or TBS. They'll air potentially on both. We don't exactly know, and we don't know kickoff times quite yet either. But 10 of the 13 football games will be conference matchups, so be pretty big games. But they will be down probably on the pecking order. Fox and ESPN will continue to get their picks of Big 12 games every week, the first picks, and then no, from what I understand, no content from Fox and ESPN on their linear platforms will be reduced. So this is just like an extra game, an extra third tier game that would normally go to streaming is now going to be on linear with TNT.
Yeah, and I imagine the Big 12, look, they still have some time before they have to go negotiate a new media rights deal, but I imagine they're pretty excited about this because they didn't have to give up anything and they essentially just get more viewers for games they were already going to be playing.
Absolutely. This is, I think it's a huge win for the Big 12. That's certainly how they feel. You've got, all these games that were originally on streaming are now going to be on this pretty big linear platform. And I think they're hoping to get some involvement with inside the NBA show as well, especially during their basketball season, the Big 12 basketball season coinciding with the NBA basketball season. That maybe there's a little bit of talk right about the Big 12. So I think this is certainly a win, and like you mentioned, um, this does kind of a little bit help them probably in any negotiations down the road for a new television deal that will start in would start I think in fall of 31. And so work on that deal I think has already been started in a lot of ways, right, with doing things like this. They get another network involved, so they have four networks kind of involved in their rights package, for linear networks. You've got ESPN and Fox are the main two, and then CBS Sports will have 26 men's basketball games. And then, of course, now you add TNT Sports.
Yeah, it's an interesting time, and I guess it saves face a little bit for TNT relative to them losing the NBA. All right, we've got to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with Ross Dellinger right after this. Welcome back to Yahoo Finance Sports Report. I'm your host, Joe Pompliano. I'm here with Ross Dellinger, Yahoo Sports' senior college football reporter. I want to change tunes here a little bit and talk about revenue sharing in the House settlement. I mean, this is a topic that feels like it's been going on forever and it will go on for a lot longer as well. But you've written extensively about this. And one of the things that I saw you talk about the other day was how some of these revenue sharing agreements are already being sent to athletes and not necessarily football athletes yet. But I think you mentioned specifically the University of Arizona and some other schools that have already started to send these out and get an agreement in place for athletes to sign. Maybe just talk a little bit about like where we're at today, right? Because I think most people understand, okay, revenue sharing is coming, but it's not necessarily approved yet. Some schools are being a little bit more proactive than others in regards to getting documents in hands versus letting NILs handle it. So any insight you can provide there around kind of like how most schools are approaching it and where we go from here?
Yeah, this is an incredibly complicated situation, and it's still very murky, even for college administrators who are trying to figure out how this is going to work. So, Joe, for the last 3 years or so, NIL has been in existence, which is just the right for players. The NCAA gave players the right to make money off of their name, image, and likeness, NIL, in endorsement and commercial opportunities. Of course, that has turned into boosters paying players a salary. That's what happens in college athletics. And so, for the last 3 years, around 80% of the compensation athletes are getting are coming from boosters. Those numbers are provided by some platforms that work in the space, and I think they're pretty accurate. And so now there's a settlement, right, of an antitrust case. And the settlement will provide the opportunity for schools to pay athletes directly instead of the money coming from boosters. So the idea is to move the money coming from boosters under the school umbrella operation and let them pay share revenue that they get from TV and ticket sales and sponsorships to athlete. They get a cut of the revenue. The only way for that to happen is if the settlement does get approved. It's been preliminarily approved, but there's an objection process now. And I would guess there are going to be a lot of objections to the settlement coming in January and into February. And there'll be hearings in March and then a final approval hearing in April. If in April it's approved, right, schools starting July 1 will be able to directly pay players and share revenue with players. And so right now, getting ahead of it, schools are signing players for next fall, right? So this is the first revenue sharing class of athletes. And some schools are taking a somewhat proactive approach in sending out revenue share contracts with contingencies for that the settlement gets passed. So um, if the settlement does get passed starting July 1, these athletes will get whatever is in their contract. There are monetary figures in the contract. There are other clauses and things like that. A lot of the contracts probably resemble the NIL collective booster contracts that players have been operating under for the last 3 years. In some players, since the revenue share doesn't start until July 1, if it is approved in April, some players will also be getting collective dollars too over the next 6-7 months until July 1 hits. So it's a kind of a weird and messy transition that we're seeing right now over the next 6 or 7 months until schools are permitted to pay the players directly in July.
How do you think the NIL collectives are going to work into this, right? If we think about the schools paying direct revenue sharing, and like a school like Tennessee has already enacted the 10% talent fee that's going to be on top, and fans are essentially paying part of that fee themselves. But if you think about collectives, is this something that's going to just be additive to the athletes where the collectives are still going to go out and raise a ton of money and that's going to be on top of the revenue sharing? Or do you think some of the schools are going to have them back off a little bit and just say, hey, look, we're going to be giving a percentage of revenue? That's what the pot is.
Well, I think that schools are approaching the future of their collectives in a couple of different ways. I think those schools who won't be able to meet, and I should say there's a cap, right? There's like a salary cap
Yeah.
of around probably the first year will be low 20 millions. So it'll be right around probably 20 to 22 million that each school is permitted to share with their athletes. Schools that can reach that have enough money and resources to pay that much, I think will keep their collective around, as you kind of mentioned there, to exceed the cap through outside collective dollars, right? NIL dollars, like athletes have been receiving. Schools that don't have enough resources to meet that cap um, will probably not need their collective and probably shut it down. And I think in a lot of instances, we've already seen that happening. Collectives are being phased out at certain places, especially like at the group of five level and things like that. I think you're going to see some collectives go away or be very limited in their capacity. So there's a couple of different ways I think that that schools are handling it. The one big change, along with the biggest change, which is schools directly paying athletes, is that all money, it doesn't come from a school. It ends up in an athlete's hands. So all non-school compensation has to be approved by a clearinghouse, a new clearinghouse. It's an enforcement entity that will be created. I believe it's going to be run by Deloitte, and they're going to run this clearinghouse, and NIL deals that go through the clearinghouse from boosters must be true and meet fair market value. So they must be true endorsement commercial deals. Now, how they're gonna figure out what's true and what's not is the outstanding kind of issue. So that clearinghouse has a lot of question marks involved in it.
Yeah, and do you think the NILs will play any role in buyouts maybe? Like, the reason I ask, right, is because it feels like there's been a lot of chatter around certain buyouts this year. And in the past, Texas A&M's a great example with Jimbo Fisher. Like, some of these buyouts you look at and they're like, they can't fire that guy. That's way too much money for him not to coach. And then they go and do it. But like Florida already said they're not going to be firing their coach. People have talked about Brian Kelly at LSU, a bunch of other schools as well. What is your feeling on the dynamic of buyouts and kind of where we stand in the business of college football today?
Well, I think the coaches that entered the season on the biggest kind of hot seat, the hottest seat, you might say, are Florida, Baylor, Dave Aranda there, Billy Napier at Florida, in Arkansas, Sam Pittman. And right now, it appears that all of those coaches will keep their job, despite so-so seasons, if not losing seasons. And I think a big reason for that is that schools have to come up right with $20 million, not just next year, but for the foreseeable future. And that 20 million will rise. There's incremental kind of increases in the salary cap. So by the end of 10 years, the settlement is 10 years long. The cap is likely to be over 30 million every year. So it's a lot of money, and certainly that is having an effect on the decisions from administrators as far as firing coaches and potentially down the road here, hiring coaches and in adding buyouts to their contract. What will that look like? I think you're going to see that decrease. And I think you've already seen the impact of the athlete revenue sharing on that by coaches so far, at least what we've seen, keeping their job. And there's a chance this year, if you talk to folks in the kind of the sports agent, coaching agent world, that there will not be a single power conference coach fired, which would be the first time in a long, long time, maybe decades. We haven't seen something like that. There still could be one or two maybe, but there's a sense that it will be very, very low. And I think that's all because of this situation.
Ross, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, good to be on.
The clock is winding down here, but we have just enough time for some final buzz. The last thing I want to leave you with today is Adidas signing 16-year-old high school basketball player Kalina Smith. Now, Kalina Smith is the first high school girls basketball player to be signed by Adidas to an NIL deal. She's also the first signing for Adidas under Candace Parker, after the brand named the WNBA legend president of Adidas women's basketball in May. Now, Smith is going to be wearing Adidas for her high school basketball games and her AAU team, including James Harden's Adidas sneakers. And she's a phenomenal player. She's the top recruit of the 2027 college recruiting class in women's basketball, and she has already gotten over 20 college scholarship offers, including schools like USC, Louisville, UConn, UCLA, LSU, and South Carolina. But the reason why I want to leave you with this today is because this is a growing trend that we all need to be paying attention to. And that trend is high school athletes signing NIL deals. Now, there's 39 states in Washington, D.C. across the United States today that allow high school athletes to sign NIL deals. There's 11 states that do not allow high school NIL deals. That includes states like Alabama, Hawaii, Indiana, Michigan, Montana, Ohio, South Carolina, Texas, and a few others. But this is going to be changing in the immediate future. I expect more states to enact NIL legislation. So rather than just college players, high school players can sign these deals as well. And I don't believe Smith is going to be the last, especially when you think about a topic like women's basketball, a trend that is growing throughout professional sports and amateur sports as well. We're all out of time, so it's officially game over for this week. Thank you so much to Ross Dellinger and for all of you for joining us. Make sure to tune in to Yahoo Finance Sports Report on Thursdays at 5 p.m. wherever you get your podcast. I'm your host, Joe Pompliano. See you next time.
This content was not intended to be financial advice and should not be used as a substitute for professional financial services.